My name is Xiaowen Zhu. I'm the director of Center for Chinese Contemporary Art. We are based in Manchester, UK. We're the only nonprofit art space in the UK dedicated to artists of East and Southeast Asian heritage. And on this occasion, we're extremely excited to have Mengyun, Roisin, and Vivek joining us. Today's online talk, its theme is about craft, its present day relevance, and the history of transculturalism. As some of you might know, Mengyun is currently being hosted at CFCCA as our artist in residence. This is a program that has been launched at CFCCA since many years ago. And every time we invite one artist to stay in our space and also use our studio and sometimes gallery to make new work. But we never give the artist any particular pressure to be productive. But on this occasion, I know that Mengyun has been extremely productive, as you can see a bit through her background. That's a work in progress of a site-specific installation that she has been working on during her residency. And I want to mention that her residency especially focuses on the tradition of woodblock printing, which is a technique originated in China and later developed in India. Mengyun's recent work also investigates craft as a vehicle for cultural exchange. They pay attention to the little traditions typically neglected in Chinese art history, as well as the ways in which craft connects to her own practice as an artist working across multiple media, including painting and installation. She is also a bilingual writer, and she's currently based in London. Let's first welcome Mengyun to share her presentation with us.
Thank you so much, Xiaowen, for inviting me to this residency, and I've had an incredible time exploring the space and working with the wonderful team here, and they have really satisfied all my needs. And I'm really, really grateful for the amazing speakers we have today. Okay, I'm gonna start with a bit of self-introduction. My name is Han Mengyun, and I'm an artist currently based in London. I was originally trained in the Western, or more precisely, the Soviet academic oil painting system in China until I was 18. And then I studied in various countries such as the US, Japan, Germany, and the UK, where I was exposed to many different things, from post-war American abstraction, Chinese painting and calligraphy, Sanskrit and Indology, to Indian and Islamic art, with special interest in miniature painting and manuscript. My multicultural background and interests ultimately led me to make the work, The Pavilion of Three Mirrors, which recently was shown at the Diriyah Biennial in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So the work is based on this really famous story told by the 12th century Persian poet Nizami in Khamsa. And it's quite an incredible story about Alexander the Great having a sort of argument with VIP guests from all over the world, discussing who's the better painter, the Greek or the Chinese. And then they decided to have a live battle in the court. And the room was divided by a curtain. The Greeks were painting on the left side, and then the Chinese were painting on the other side. And when it's all done, they unveiled the curtain, and they were so surprised to see two identical paintings. The Greek painting, it wasn't really described in any of the text, but it's probably something really realistic, based on the Greek tradition of mimesis. Whereas the Chinese painting, upon closer observation, they realized that the Chinese did not paint. They simply polished the mirror, which reflects the painting across the room. And I was just completely blown away by this story, and I had to realize it in my own art practice. Beyond the surface meaning of the pre-modern culture exchange, The story offers many, many insights. The first one would be, it provides a shift of epistemology, as well as a comparison of differing epistemologies in thinking about painting, the meaning of painting and how one can paint. It also calls for a diversified conversation in art beyond the East-West paradigm, which is a post-colonial obsession. And third, it poses a question whether art history, a discipline developed in Europe during the colonial period, can suffice to understand non-Western art, which is often discussed and mentioned in poetry, folk tales, and mythologies. Much like the Indian term for history, itihasa, it is not the chronological events, the facts that matter, but the interpretation of those events that generate meaning for the art in a wider social, cultural, and religious context. And finally, on a personal level, this body of work is also my attempt to alleviate the symptoms of my aesthetic and perceptual schizophrenia caused by my hybridity as I perceive the fundamental differences between various painting traditions. And in order to express myself, I often have to deal with and overcome the impossibility of these perceptual conflicts. The obvious example would be, say, dealing with perspectives. The one point perspective in Western painting, the so-called isometric perspective in Chinese scroll, and the God's perspective or the bird's eye view in Persian painting, etc. So the challenge I face as an artist with such a kind of multicultural experience is to deal with those perceptual conflicts, to try and forge harmony, or simply to embrace those conflicts. So this is the result of that body of work. Due to very limited time, I'm just gonna skim through. So instead of presenting a very literal interpretation of the story, I decided to make it more abstract, take it as a point of departure. And the whole space is about experiencing the transition, the alternation between illusion, reflection, and reality. So one of the devices that I employ to deal with this kind of aesthetic and perceptual schizophrenia is by way of making or painting books. While learning Indian and Islamic art and culture, as well as traditional Chinese visual cultures, I became fascinated by the art of the book and the making of manuscripts. Unlike the oil paintings on the wall we see today, these paintings in the past are contained within books alongside text and other images. The book was the perfect medium to carry all kinds of information, and it is so portable that people were just taking them all over the places. And that's how ideas and forms travel and find new homes. The book form also reflects the organization of thoughts, how one determines the space between the borders and the body of the text or image. The page is, in my mind, a thinking mind. And in comparing all these different books made in different cultures and different times, we can easily see the similarities and differences, as well as the continuity and connection between the ways in which different peoples conceive the shape of thinking. The generosity and the all-encompassing potential of the book medium brings to mind Mallarmé's words. Everything in the world exists to end up as a book. And this inspires me to treat the images in the book as a reference for my painting. If we go back to the Pavilion of Three Mirrors, you can see that these paintings are actually books. They're pages in manuscripts, some loose, some bound. The diptychs are the left and right pages of a book, and they're speaking to each other in time. The triptychs, the first triptychs, are mimicking the extended temporality of the Chinese scroll. The Indian American scholar A.K. Ramanujan wrote this fascinating essay called "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" And he analyzed the questions in different ways. And the one I'm discussing here is the question, is there an or only one Indian way of thinking? His answer was, there is no single Indian way of thinking. There are great and little traditions, ancient and modern, rural and urban, classical and folk. And I was inspired to then ask the question, is there only one Chinese way of thinking? And of course, we can ask so many questions, like, is there only one Western way of thinking? So on and so forth. And I was thinking, so what are the little traditions apart from the dominating literati painting tradition and discourse? And then I started to look into crafts, these little traditions, which have long been deemed as inferior in the Chinese art discourse. And one of the little traditions I'm exploring is the woodblock printing technique. It was said to have originated in China, and the earliest dated printed book is this Diamond Sutra from Tang Dynasty, it's on the right. And other scholars have argued otherwise, that it might not have originated in China. But as an artist, I'm not so interested in the idea of originality, as it seems to be a kind of endless and futile endeavor that only creates hatred and competition. What fascinates me instead is the history of connection made possible by the sharing of this and many other techniques and traditions. China and India and many other cultures are intimately connected because of the production of books, the circulation, the dissemination of ideas. And all of these enable the cultural exchange on a massive and global scale that has long predated our global, current global capitalistic connection. And these influences still have really prolonging effects and vividly palpable today. So you can see that's the woodblock printing for making books. And then it developed into movable type in China so that you can make corrections and edit. In 2020, right before the pandemic, I did a field trip in Jaipur, India to explore their woodblock tradition, which is still in use today to make these really beautiful textiles. And I brought a lot of them back to London and started to experiment on using them in my painting during lockdown. So these are some pictures of my studio in London. I'm going to show you a few examples of how I use it. So you can see that the painting is a page mimicking the form of a manuscript, and I'm using the wood blocks and printing on canvas to create this floral border for the flower. And I guess Vivek can see, maybe it's very similar to the kind of Mughal botanical kind of miniature painting. And I also experimented on the kind of marbling effect of printing on canvas using a lot of water. I also experimented with printing in different shapes. I mean, the work is very dark because I made them during lockdown, that's why. Yeah, and I was also using one of the blocks that really looked like a brick to make these architectural forms. And a lot of them were also based on Islamic manuscript. But then I'm speaking about contemporary issues. And another important aspect of my work is architectural installation. So while visiting many religious sites such as Dunhuang, Mogao Grotto, temples, churches, etc., I realized that the painted or sculpted images must not be seen in isolation from its surrounding elements. But the the proportion of the space, the ritual performed within the space, the light, or more importantly, the darkness of the space that contribute to the meaning of the work or the experience of the work. The images in the caves are seen in darkness or under very dimmed lights or torches. And the motifs decorating the space is also extremely important. And while I was in the Buddhist caves, looking above at the ceiling, I suddenly had this epiphany that this whole cave is a visual configuration of the cosmos. The motifs arranged by the architectural structure are the elemental vocabulary that make up this world. So in knowing that, in realizing that my art practice is no longer just a practice of making art objects to be hung on the wall, but a process of world building. And Logic of the Ether is the result of making my own cosmos as an expression of longing to connect with something larger than this mundane life. So I used the blocks I got from Jaipur, India, and I printed all of these textiles in my studio, and I designed the structure to mimic the structure of the cave, the ceiling. And it's a two-body structure, and the other one is literally a cave in darkness, and I made some videos projected onto the walls directly. And the video was me lip syncing Rig Veda, this creation hymn discussing the origin of the world. And then I also put a video I filmed in Jaipur. And it was the film, the Kites Festival. So everybody was just flying kites and practicing on their rooftop. And it was just fascinating to experience this coexistence of mundane and religious life and connection with the unknown. So what I'm doing now during my artist residency at CFCCA is I'm making an installation called the Serenade. It is sort of a reiteration of my recent exhibition in Shanghai called Night, that responds to the appalling incident of the mother of 8 boys being found chained and locked up in a shed in Suzhou, China. I was really pained by this incident and made a film based on poems I wrote in thinking about all the darkness that women experience in this world. In making the installation there in Shanghai, I chose the Dong cloth, like a particular fabric made by the Dong minority in China, to create this kind of a dark backdrop, this one. And one of the poems I wrote is directly inspired by the process of making the cloth, which is extremely laborious. Usually takes a Dong woman about 9 months to complete, from repeated dyeing with indigo and washing and drying to pounding with egg whites into the fiber to create this final lush sheen on the surface. If you look at the picture, you can see that the fabric almost looks like waxed paper. To me, the Dong cloth embodies a pivotal duality of woman's existence. The darkness represents woman's labor unvalidated, and lives abused and lost, while the luster symbolizes the light brought about by their vitality and strength. So the Serenade is a piece of music sung or played in the open air, typically by a Mennonite for his beloved. But my serenade is not so much of a love song, but an acknowledgement of women's suffering, a dedication to their beauty and strength. The dark textile ceiling is reiterated here in the form of a wooden pavilion. The space is lit halfway, and you can watch the film under the ceiling just like an outdoor cinema. As you walk about in space, you experience the transition between the day and the night, the moving and the still image, the text and the image, the indoor and the outdoor, the self and the other. To conclude my presentation, I want to make note of a somewhat magical connection I have with Manchester that was somewhat quite unexpected. So I was born in Wuhan, which became sister city with Manchester in 1986, 3 years before my birth. Both cities have a history of textile production. But I totally forgot about it until I was visiting the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry over the weekend. And while being in the textile section, I recalled memories of my childhood being in a textile factory in Wuhan where my mom was working. I remember the cotton, the yarn, the machines, the woman, and maybe this is why I'm making the work I'm making now. Thank you.
Thank you, Moyun. That was extremely beautiful and also very concise and very rich. I feel there's so much to reflect and to process. Maybe let's move on to Roisin and then let's hear about Roisin's presentation. And I feel like there's a very nice connection and lineage maybe leading up to her presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, which is super exciting. And I'm delighted to be part of such an interesting program today. And there are so many connections between all of the speakers, I think. I've had some technological issues today, so I think that my slides are going to be shared. Ah, here they are. Brilliant. I hope everyone can see those. So please bear with me while I'm looking at one screen and talking from the other. So as I was introduced, I'm one of the curators at the William Morris Gallery in London. And if you could move to the next slide, please. So some of you might have been there, some of you will not have. I very much hope people come. We're in almost central London. We're about half an hour from the very centre of London. So I hope this perhaps will inspire you to come and visit if you haven't been before. So we are the only public gallery and the biggest collection anywhere in the world of work by William Morris, who was a 19th century designer, craftsman, writer, socialist, conservationist, pretty much anything you can think of, William Morris did it. And we have a very large collection of work by him. So it's approximately 10,000 objects. And this relates to his entire output. So there is writing, there's socialist works, there's poetry, and then there's also some of the things that you can see here. So there's a beautiful woodblock print, top right. There is textile, so he did a lot of textile printing, which relates, already to what we've heard today. In the bottom, you can see some ceramics. So he did ceramics and glass, and so these are tiles. There's a very large tile panel. And then down to the right, this is a picture of the building on a sunnier day than today, but we're located in a 18th century, so a Georgian building that William Morris lived in when he was a child, and it was turned into a museum in 1950. So we have both permanent exhibitions there, which tell the story of Morris's life and work. And then we also have temporary exhibitions, which give us an opportunity to think more broadly about Morris, about his implications for today, and also about his connections with other countries, other people, other movements, whether he was aware of them or not. So that's what I'm going to be talking about a bit today. So next slide, please. So by way of introduction, Morris was one of the founders of what is known as the arts and crafts movement, which was a movement in the 19th century in Britain, which was basically a reaction to industrialization. So Britain was at the center of the global industrial revolution, in part because of the textile trade that Mengyun was just speaking about. And as a reaction to this kind of very new, rapidly changing industrial society and the social and perceived artistic problems that came from it, a group of people with William Morris at their center tried to think differently about the world and about creation, about what they were making, how making things was contributing to a a negative society or a positive society. And so what he did was he set up a company, and they made everything from furniture to stained glass to metalwork to textiles to wallpaper. But everything that they made was based upon sort of basic principles, which are listed on the left here. So these were things like the essential role of nature. Obviously, in a kind of industrialized society, nature starts to take a back seat. And so they were very interested in how the natural world could contribute to design. They were interested in natural materials and also in kind of honesty of materials. So if you're using wood, it should look like wood. If you're using ceramics, it should look like ceramics. Also, honesty of construction, the idea that there shouldn't be lots of artifice in how things are made, that they should be kind of straightforward, approachable, accessible to ordinary people. This was all based on craft knowledge and craft skills. And Morris was really outstanding in the sense that he understood how to make something before he designed it. And this ties into the next point, which is integrity of design and manufacture. And so there is a kind of a Marxian element to Morris's arts and crafts movement, which is that the idea that if you divide labor in the way that it had been done after the Industrial Revolution, then the integrity of the craftsperson is compromised because they don't get the joy and the creative satisfaction of designing and then making and producing something. They just are reduced to a very small part, being like a cog in a machine, essentially. And that is it's not a holistic process for the designer or the maker, but it's also not good for the object, because how can you design something successfully if you don't understand how it's made? So before he designed everything, Morris would understand the process. So he knew how to weave, he knew how to dye fabrics, he knew how to make furniture, he knew how to paint stained glass. He understood all of these things. The next point is simplicity of form. And so I think especially in the chair and also in the candlestick that you can see here, there's this real kind of stripped back, very simple, looks quite modern even to our eyes, this idea that you don't need a lot of extras, you just need something simple, something beautiful, but it doesn't need a lot of sort of extra of things to make it essential, to make it beautiful. And then the last point I've touched on is utopian socialism. So the idea that craft is something that can contribute to a better world, and that the objects that we have and the people who make them are integral to a healthy, productive, happy society. So really what Morris wanted to do was to change the world through craft and through making. And whether he was successful or not is something we will come back to. But these are the kind of key points of the arts and crafts movement in England or in Britain that then seem to have lots of resonances in other countries and other places, other times throughout the world. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of projects that we've done at the gallery over the last few years that kind of tie in with all of these ideas from Morris and then in other cultural contexts. I definitely don't want to say that Morris influences people and he's the foundation of everything, because that's definitely not true. While he was famous in his lifetime and his writing was translated and it gets spread around the world, so by 1900, 1910 he's translated into lots of different languages, people all around the world are reading him. Definitely other cultures, other countries have their own traditions that then they bring to it, and it's a kind of an amalgamation. The other thing I should mention that I'm not really talking about today is that Morris himself took from lots of other cultures and lots of other cultural contexts. So he, of course, at the time he was living, India was part of the British Empire, so there was a huge amount of connection with India, and he was very aware of Indian crafts, Indian fabric, Indian dyeing techniques, and admired hugely Indian craft production. He also had a big collection of Islamic art, and he was an advisor to the V&A Museum on Islamic art and design, and he had it in his home, art from the Middle East, from Turkey, Persia, etc. So Morris himself exists in an international context, but the movements I'm talking about all happen chronologically after Morris, so I'm not going to mention so much about Morris's influences. So the first one was an exhibition last year, and this was about the Young Poland movement. So Młoda Polska, which means Young Poland, was a movement in Poland in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it came around in a time when Poland did not have political sovereignty over itself. So Poland had been chopped into 3 bits by the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was in a partition. And even though there was a strong Polish cultural identity, there was not political identity. Polish people and their language and their culture was suppressed, violently suppressed in lots of instances. But within this period of political oppression, there was this incredible cultural flowering of art, craft, and design. And this happened mainly in Krakow and in an area called the Tatra Mountains, which were both areas in the Austro-Hungarian partition, which was a little bit more kind of politically relaxed. There was a bit more freedom. And it was this idea that even though Poland did not have national sovereignty, Polish cultural identity, and especially expressed through craft and historic traditions of making, was something that was keeping this perceived country of Poland together. So their cultural heritage, including things like wooden architecture, and you can see this incredible model, which is an enormous model we had in the exhibition. That's based on a real house in the Tatra Mountains. Wood making, textiles, batik, paper cutting, stained glass, basically, you know, all of these kind of traditional folk arts, and also lace making. And you can see in the image on the top right, this is the artist's young daughter making lace by traditional means. But you can see that there's something kind of very almost sacred about this picture. You know, she looks a little bit like the Virgin Mary. It's almost like she's got a halo of lace around her head, and her concentration, it looks like what she's doing is almost a spiritual practice. And I think this is something important to bear in mind, the idea of craft being something spiritual and making being something that elevates you. And, you know, as Naomi was talking earlier about wanting to be connected to something higher or bigger than yourself. Next, please. So another exhibition that I worked on, also relating to this idea of transcultural craft, was about the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus was a movement in Germany. The Bauhaus School was founded in 1919 in the context of Germany's crushing defeat in the First World War. And it was set up, the school was set up by an architect called Walter Gropius, who was a very interesting person because he's both very kind of modernist, and the Bauhaus is considered, you know, a modern movement and the kind of one of the very first modernist movements in the world. And Gropius is definitely interested in that. But the Bauhaus was also founded on craft techniques. And originally, they very much were interested in making things by hand. So you can see some of the examples of things in the exhibition. We have this triptych, which is, again, it's a religious scene, top left. We have woven textile, which was hand woven on a loom. And so it has this very kind of modernist aesthetic, but the technique of making it is very traditional. And then in the lower pictures, you can see ceramics, and the ceramic studio at the Bauhaus was incredibly rustic. You know, they dug their own clay, and they had to chop down trees to make firewood for their kilns and to keep warm. And they grew their own vegetables. And it was very much this idea of a craft community. And this idea of forging a better world through craft and through making out of the kind of the shattered and, you know, economically hopeless situation in Germany at that time. So Gropius was really interesting in that he refers to Morris and, you know, he says, we have to return to the crafts. We have to create a new guild of craftsmen. So even though he's looking to the future, he's very much looking to medieval, you know, techniques, ideas, social structures to create that future, which is exactly what Morris was doing. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is an exhibition that I'm working on currently. So this will be in 2024. It hasn't actually been formally announced yet, so don't tell anybody. But this is an exhibition about the relationship between Japanese Mingei and the British arts and crafts movement. So the Mingei movement was, Mingei literally means art of the people. Min is people, and gei is art, as in the word geisha. And Mingei was a folk art movement which flourished in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s. And kind of like the arts and crafts movement in England, there were sort of protagonists. So Sosetsu Yanagi was a philosopher and sort of aesthetic thinker. And then you had kind of makers, like people like Shoji Hamada, who was a potter, and other makers of traditional Japanese techniques, so paper making, pottery, furniture, etc. And so they knew about Morris. Morris had been translated into Japanese, and they read him in English and in Japanese. And so they translated Morris's ideas to Japan for the 21st century and kind of fused it with interest in Korean design, Korean ceramics, traditional Japanese folk crafts, and also Buddhist philosophy. So it's this kind of really interesting cultural mix of all these different ideas. And it's in the context of rapid industrialization and cultural nationalism in Japan. So obviously Japan really industrializes very, very quickly in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this 1920s, 1930s period is, of course, in the lead up to the Second World War, when Japan is really, kind of flexing its nationalistic muscles a bit and becoming an imperial nation in East Asia. And so it's very interesting how the Mingei movement it's not a nationalist movement as such, but it's in the context of this changing situation, changing social political situation in Japan. And something else that's interesting about the word Mingei is now that it's used in all kinds of contexts. So there is a Mingei museum in San Diego in California, that isn't just about Japanese craft, it's about art of the people everywhere. It's about universal folk craft. Next slide, please. So that brings me kind of to the end, really. But this idea of craft as a cure, and what does craft do for individuals and for societies? And the more I've all of these projects were originally separate, but the more I think about it, the more I see common denominators in them. And all of them really are about using craft and using making as a way of changing social situations, political situations that the practitioners don't like. So they tend to flourish in times of severe social, political dislocation. So the arts and crafts movement in England, massive industrialization, huge poverty, huge social problems in London and around. The Young Poland movement in this time of political non-existence. And then in the Bauhaus, Germany is a really, difficult place to be immediately after First World War. And then also in Japan in the 1920s and 30s, they're really grappling with this incredibly changing society. So when in times of social distress, the craft seems to be something that people want to do. And it seems to be a way of forming communities when people cannot cope with or don't want to engage with the current political social situation. And so sometimes it's an economic solution. Sometimes, like the Bauhaus, they are trying to make things to sell. They're trying to think about production. They're trying to think about, rationalizing modes of production to create industry, to create better design, to make money. But it's never just about the money. It's always about social transformation more generally. And this often is accompanied by new ways of living. So communal experiments of living. I said at the Bauhaus, they grew their own vegetables. William Morris and his family, built their own house. There's always a kind of community aspect to it. And as I mentioned, there's often this sort of idea of romantic nationalism in the sense that people are looking back, they're looking back to the kind of landscape and to kind of a simpler political time. But generally, this isn't associated with sort of nationalism in the way we think about it. It's not generally sort of associated with militarism or exclusivity. It's generally an inclusive sort of creative romanticization of the nation. And then the question for the end, are all these movements were they all doomed to fail? Were they successful? Morris didn't change the world through wallpaper. The Bauhaus closed in the 30s because of the Nazis. The Young Poland movement, ended after a relatively short time. And we're not really any closer, arguably, to some of the social cures that they were trying to do with craft. We still have environmental catastrophe. We still have a lot of poverty. We still have people making things in terrible conditions. But on the other side, the world in some respects is a lot more appreciative of craft and skills and slow fashion and things like that, and where we are as a society kind of again grappling with how we think about making as a way of creating a better society and the role that the producer and the consumer have in that. So Morris, I think, can be credited with being one of the first people to think about some of the issues that we still think about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roisin. That was incredible. I've learned really so much from the presentation. And I feel like I can imagine the invisible audience here, they would also have a lot to reflect upon. And next we have Vivek. He has also prepared a presentation for us.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me and can you see my slides? Okay, so I wanted to thank the Center for Chinese Contemporary Art for this invitation. I honestly hadn't heard of Mengyun's work before, and when the invitation came, I started to look through her portfolio and her practice, and I was really kind of struck by some of the overlaps and some of my teaching and my research, and I was really delightfully surprised for the opportunity to engage with just such a great artist. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk us through two cases of transculturation, which is a word that I think needs a lot of unpacking when we're thinking historically. And I am a historian of Islamic and South Asian art and architecture, as I was introduced, but these are cases from my teaching that I'm going to talk about. And they're cases in which craft, which is another idea that I think we need to think very seriously about, is heavily is at stake. After I talk about these two sort of historical cases, I'm going to talk about two contemporary South Asian American artists with whom Mengyun's work is inherently in dialogue with. Whether or not contemporary artists like it, their work is in dialogue with people that they might not necessarily deliberately decide to put their work in conversation with. But these are the artists that come to my mind when I'm looking at her work, and as well as these are two historical cases, case studies that I think are definitely in play with her practice. So the first historical event was the siege of Baghdad in 1258, which was a time when this fabled Dar al-Hikmah, the book of the House of Wisdom, a major library of books, and which were both Islamic, worldly books. There were Greek books there. Were destroyed. This library was destroyed and dispersed, and so 1258 is when it happened. This is one of the major sort of watershed moments within Islamic art and really global art, and it resulted in a really amazing exchange between Chinese artists and artists living in Iraq, Iran, and Central Asia. And what ended up happening is a lot of craft practices came to be in exchange. One of those practices was the art of metalwork. So as you can see here, you have prototypes coming out of Chinese Chinese blue and white ceramics, which metalwork artists collectively adapted. And I want to sort of stress the fact that I'm not talking in terms of influence. I'm actually giving these artists their agency, elements of Chinese ceramics. There are many other ways in which Chinese ceramics are in play for across various media in Islamic art, but it's important to note that Chinese ceramics are just really, they go global, and I want to direct you to a recent exhibition at the Louvre Abu Dhabi called Dragon and Phoenix: Centuries of Exchange Between Chinese and Islamic Worlds, which really took up this issue over a long durée. And I would also like to mention the work of my colleague Ladan Akbarnia, who wrote a fantastic dissertation on the idea of Hittite, and also took up this exchange in a post-Mongol world. This paper was obviously an important technology that the Chinese introduced, and it carried on for many centuries, paper making, but also literal paper, Chinese paper, coming from China and being used for some of the most important books, such as the Quran. So we can talk about this in terms of craft, but we can also talk about it in terms of materiality. There are ways in which an object, like a metal object, might evoke a Chinese ceramic through the way a surface is heavily burnished. So it's not just about mimicking particular forms, but it's also about the actual materiality of something. So this is the first case. There's a huge, interaction between the Chinese world as well as a broader Islamic world. And there's so many ways in which this plays out. And it's one that becomes so intimately connected that certain elements of iconographies within Indian and Islamic practices, they're no longer, their Chineseness sort of falls away. They're no longer viewed as something that is coming, that the reference to China is perceivable in a particular moment. And that's important when we're thinking about transculturation, is what moment we're thinking of with transculturation as an idea. Do we think about it as, post the event, or do we think about it within the period it's happening? So the interaction between China and Islam, especially after the Mongol invasions, is an important moment. But a second historical case I would like to bring to your attention, which I think is really, it speaks a lot when it's put in dialogue with Mengyun's work. I think it's quite fruitful. So I'd like to introduce all of you to this cache of textiles that was found mainly in Fustat in Old Cairo. And these textiles have been studied primarily by a curator named Ruth Barnes. And they were made from roughly around the 12th century to the 16th century. And they were sort of found in this big heap. And there's another archaeological site, which we know known as Qusayr al-Qadim, where other textiles of these forms were found. And these textiles are really central to narrating the history of the connected histories of the Indian Ocean world in the medieval and early modern periods. Their patterns draw heavily on certain kinds of patterns that would be found in Western India, especially in Gujarat, where this form of woodblock dyed text or block-printed dyed textiles were made and famous. today we think of places like Kutch and where the Ajrak textile workers are still in business, and we consume and still are trading their textiles globally. But these are some medieval examples of these textiles, and just want to draw your attention to the colors that are being used, how and also how the repetition of patterns also evokes sort of the process in which these textiles have been made. So these are really laborious processes, which Mengyun mentioned in one of the textiles that she was drawing attention to, just the amount of labor that goes into the process of making. Now, craft, which I think is a word that we should think about a little bit more, is something that I find to be inherently intermedial. So what's interesting about these Gujarati Western Indian textiles is that many of their patterns show up on buildings in Yemen as surface decoration. So they're traveling across the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, and clearly part of a visual repertoire of artists who may have been moving on similar routes. But how does a textile or a textile object, something that is so mobile in the medieval and early modern world, mediate these sort of transcultural encounters, is something that's present within the fustat fragments, as you see here, the fustat finds, as well as in Mengyun's work, as she has, I would say, a lot more access to archives than these 16th or 15th century makers. So I want to sort of think about two contemporary artists with whom Mengyun's work comes into dialogue, whether she likes it or not, really. So one of those artists is Zarina Hashmi, who lived from 1937 to 2020, and the way that Mengyun works with text. So here is a work called Palace on the Page, and she's inscribed the word Koch, which means palace, in the center. And there's a way in which the subtle reference to words can really open up a whole world for a viewer just through very minimal references. And also we see the use of woodblock on the top and the bottom of this page, as if we're being led into a palace. And this comes into direct dialogue with the contemporary artist Zarina Hashmi, who, especially her project Home as a Foreign Place, made in 1999, in which she also sort of took in practice, it relates in practice for sure, in which she took very subtle words, single words, to map a cosmos of her life in a very intimate way. So here on the left, we see the word divar, or wall, and a very subtle print technology that she's using. So what's with Zarina, what is really important, Zarina always used to say that craft is something that saved her, that she had this ability. She studied printmaking with William Hayter, and she had this this is something that she could always turn to, first of all, for economic stability, but second of all, as a process that would guide the rest of her practice. So this is an artist that I think Mengyun certainly in dialogue with. Another artist, especially another South Asian American artist with whom her work is in dialogue with, is Shazia Sikandar, who's an artist that I've done quite a bit of work with, who actually problematizes the very notion of manuscript painting or miniature, which is something we should think about as a term that is not necessarily appropriate for a manuscript painting, but that this project of the logic of the ether that Mengyun just discussed is in dialogue with works like Epistrophe, funny enough, made in the same year here, which is also sort of an architectural imagining of the artist's cosmos, and also ways in which manuscript painting practices, somewhat of a craft, if we might think of it in the terms of this event, inform her practice. So I think that in terms of some closing thoughts, there's certainly transculturation plays out in many ways with craft, and there's a way in which one's identity is at stake in relationship to the kinds of craft practices they choose. In Mengyun's case, I think it's really quite amazing how worldly her references are, but also the labor that she goes through into really studying some of these practices, such as her knowledge of Sanskrit and her ability to think about ideas like Gama, which is the title of the work on the right. So I think that's all I have to say. But thank you, Mengyun, for sharing your practice, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be there with you in Manchester for this.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. And I'm completely happy for all the references you have made, because Zarina Hashmi's work really influenced my practice. And I think there's something really profound there. Like, the reason why I'm influenced by her work is because I see the kind of connection between the kind of Chinese monochromatic aesthetics with her sort of also monochromatic prints, and the practice, the technique of printmaking kind of brought us all together. So
I mean, she also did spend a period of her life in Japan, where she studied printmaking practices as well. So she has, she, like you, is outward facing in terms of the craft technologies that she's interested in. And there's inherently a transcultural dialogue between her and the craft practices that she's engaged in. A similar thing happened with the contemporary Indian art. Well, he's more modern, but V.S. Gaitonde, who also studied in Japan and was and worked with print practices.
That was tremendous. Thank you so much, Vivek, and thank you, Mengyun, for your reflection. Before we dive into the more discussion with the guest speakers, I want to just tell our audience a little reminder. If you are interested in sending any questions to our speakers, you can simply type it in the message box, and we will be able to select a few and read them out at the end of this online talk. So I know that Mengyun has a few questions that you have prepared for Vivek and Roisin, but actually, if I may, I wanted to ask you a question to begin with. I was really intrigued by one of your thinking process, which is there only one Chinese way of thinking? It makes me also reflect your personal background. You were born and raised in mainland China, but then you left, during your youth and went abroad to study. But it was only during your time studying abroad when you discovered your passion for Buddhist art, painting, philosophy. Could you elaborate a bit on that? How was it like for you to discover this, new self after you've moved abroad?
I guess it's quite common for people to reflect on their own cultural roots while being away, because you see the differences and you compare the different cultures. And in China, it's a bit weird with the educational system that we don't really learn much of our own tradition and culture. And the art education I received in China throughout my childhood and teenage years was this like, Western oil painting. And then I went to the States. I was kind of liberated by making abstract paintings. And towards the end of my undergraduate studies there, I just felt this really strong aversion towards everything I was doing there. The abstraction, what does it mean? Like, why does it have to be so colorful? I'm annoyed. And then that makes me, it's like gut feeling, I can't really explain. And then I encountered this really incredible article written by this French writer in New York. And then he talks about how wise Chinese painting was in ancient times, how like they already know the idea of the unfinished. You don't have to finish a painting in order to finish it. And that idea came about quite late in Europe, like from, say, Michelangelo's time. So, and I was like, oh, that's incredible. Like, there's something really profound about my own culture that I have never studied before. So that kind of started my whole journey of going back to my roots, going back to China to study calligraphy, Chinese painting, Taoism and Buddhism. And then it just, I was just unstoppable, my curiosity. I had to learn more and more, but the more I learn, the more I have to learn. And then in Buddhism, I just felt, I got really confused by all the things. I couldn't understand it. And I had the chance to study Sanskrit in Japan, so I seized that chance and decided to spend a lot of time really devoted to the study of Sanskrit and Buddhism. And that really opened up the whole world to me, not only the fascinating Indian civilization, but its connection with China, Islam, and the rest of the world. Yeah, so that was kind of the journey. And then also I worked at the British Museum for a while, and that opened up the scope of my interests more as well. In terms of like, the colonial history and the problems of the museum display that kind of erase the kind of natural original habitat of these objects. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much for that reflection. I also, one thing I noticed, throughout all three speakers' presentation is that there are few places they have been mentioned, countries that have been mentioned, from China to Japan to the UK, and then also India and Iran. As we can see, art is really connecting, different cultural origins, and like no form is permanent. Everything is constantly changing and evolving, which maybe leads to my next question for Mengyun. I know that you have been working very diligently, in your temporary studio at CFCCA, and we can see just a little bit, impression, through your video background. Can you give us a little bit a glimpse, just into what you have been working on? Is this something completely new from your former practice, or are you continuing, your ongoing research?
I definitely don't think it's new, but it's, the idea of new is more of a question for me. And I think of images or art practices as a kind of process of procreation. Like the images will mate and create babies, so, baby images. And that's what's happening to my practice. So you can see from the kind of whole development of my practice, I started with, single paintings, and then installation, and then video. And they're combined in one way or another. And so this one, the Serenade here at CFCCA that I'm installing, is kind of a big family of all the things I have done. So there's the installation with the fake textiles. They're not textiles like these things hung on the wooden structure. They're actually paper because I don't have the textiles I need. And I decided to use other things to mimic the ones I want to wanted to use but have no access to. And that is the kind of wisdom of artists and craftsmen in the past, right? Because you can't have the same material in one place or all the places, then you have to adapt and think about ways to mimic the things you want to recreate. So like so when the Indian temples and the motifs travel to, say, China, then we are kind of just doing it on paper rather than on textiles. And the architecture, we don't have the same kind of stone to make stone, like carved stone temples and caves. So in China, we resorted to wood and many other materials to create the same effect. So I want to adopt the same wisdom, to be flexible, to use whatever that is at hand and within budget. Yeah, but creating the same kind of effect. Yeah, so then I have the video going on here. I have the installation with the printed paper, and I also have the paintings in the space because I want to create this world where the paintings can dwell.
That's beautiful. Good. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope some of our audience, if they are Manchester based, we actually will offer one day to see Mengyun's work in progress in our space. That will be the 30th of September. We will organize an open studio day for audience, from Manchester or afar to join us. You can find more info on our website and social media. Since Mengyun just mentioned the arts and crafts movement, which was beautifully presented by Roisin, and I thoroughly also enjoyed the narrative and how you were, building it from the core program of your gallery, and then leading up to the historical aspects. But also, I feel like it really also comprises a few essential values, such as honesty, authenticity, the environmental awareness, and also craft as cure. I feel there are lots of aspects. We can see also personal reflections in Mengyun's and many other artists' work. I'm also quite interested, in your personal take, on the arts and crafts movement. I just wonder, like also growing up in the UK and, and studied art history and then curatorial practice. Do you feel like some of the philosophy and the values embedded in arts and crafts movement, they are relevant, to, your own practice and also your colleagues and the curatorial and the artistic network at large?
That's a great question. And I need to say I'm a fraud on two counts because one, I never studied art history. I studied normal history, like political, social, economic history. And the second reason I'm a fraud is I can't make anything. I am terrible. And it was really, really interesting to me. So I studied history and I was going to be a barrister. And it all went horribly wrong and I ended up being a curator, which is obviously fantastic. But I never really engaged with the idea of objects being part of history until my final year at university. But I never made anything. And then I got interested in objects and in art history, and I went to a graduate school in New York, which was about material culture. And the idea of objects being really essential to understanding history, because of course it's much more democratic, because written history is written by generally men. It's very narrow, it tends to be economic, it tends to be political, so all of the rich culture of the world that is not considered as important, like what you wear and what you eat and what you have around you, is neglected, and there is a real social, political, racial, gendered hierarchy around that. And so when I went to graduate school and I started being interested in all these things, I was suddenly surrounded by makers. Everybody on my course, apart from me, was, they could sew or they could cook or they could do metalwork or silversmithing or stained glass, or, they were all such creative people. And I realized how my education had been really lacking, because I had been like book smart, I guess, but I didn't have that like hands-on understanding of experience. And so that, you know, that was over 10 years ago now. And so I made it my mission to try and understand things through doing and through really thinking about, you know, how something is made. So, and that's what I try and carry with me all the time. And it doesn't come naturally to me, which is why I really, really enjoy working with practitioners and with artists and practicing artists, and, you know, going to see things and talking to conservators, for example, and people who understand like the physical makeup of an object, because, you know, as I said, Morris refused to design anything he couldn't make, and I kind of feel as a curator, you shouldn't talk about anything you also can't understand or can't make, to some extent, because it's such an integral sort of knowledge. So for me, that's a really important aspect of arts and crafts mentality that I think needs to come through with curatorial practice more. And then I also think in my personal life, I guess the more and more I think it's about environmental sustainability, and it's about, again, this material intelligence and material literacy, and knowing about something so you can fix it and repair it, you know, and not throw it away, and understanding the physical value of something. And, you know, we live in such a throwaway culture where it's cheaper to throw something away and buy a new one than it is to have it fixed. But if you have the skills to repair things, to make things yourself, then obviously that's better for you financially, and it's better for the environment. So I guess I'm trying to incorporate that principle into my daily life a bit more, and think about repair, reuse, you know, and, you know, in my clothes and in my home, and, you know, growing my own, have this very small garden, I've been growing my own vegetables, but like that idea of being more, I guess, self-sufficient, but materially literate, and have more intelligence relating to my everyday surroundings. And I hope that's the kind of idea that, you know, in a small way, if everybody starts thinking about that more, that is a way of making society more sustainable and more in keeping with arts and crafts ideology.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was incredibly helpful. We have an audience question for Vivek and Moni, actually, and I find it to be a very good question. It says, first of all, thank you all for the insightful talks. I find it super interesting when Roisin mentioned that craft making has always been related to communal activity, especially in difficult times. I wonder if Vivek or Moni has any comment about that.
I would say that craft in the context that I'm familiar with, which is medieval, early and modern South Asia, and the Islamic world, it's something that was very collaborative. So it's something that, you know, you might have somebody who makes the design, then it goes off to somebody who does the, you know, inlay, and it goes off to somebody. And these are all skills that people were trained in. Sometimes they those skills, even in painting practices. So Mengyun talked about about manuscript painting. You know, the person that did the layout was different from the person who actually did the filling, who did all of these different steps in the making of an object, a single object. So this idea of single authorship isn't always in play when you think about how collaborative some of these craft technologies are to have a finished object. So that's how I would answer that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Vivek said about the kind of collaborative nature of craft. The making of a painting or any kind of object is not just one person's grand masterpiece, but it's a group of people, not only the living, but also the dead. You know, it's a historical knowledge being passed down from generations to generations. And for me, working with craft is like when I was using the wood block, and I kind of refused to make my own blocks, because I really like the feeling that I'm working with a bunch of people. I was feeling like part of a collective. I was working with the history of images and ideas. There's something really, really beautiful and nice about being anonymous for a moment. And I think the beauty of craft is also heavily reliant on anonymity, that it allows you to forget about the ego, the self, and you dissolve into the feeling of being one with the entire world, and also to get away from language and dwell or speak with the language of forms that are actually way more open-ended. Yeah, and
I think I would also add that with guilds, or with especially in the medieval period, these craft technologies were something that were carried in the body. So they were things that transferred over the generations. So, I work a lot with scribal practices, and it's so interesting to see how the position of one's body and just how they write, whether they're sitting on the floor or they're angling a piece of paper in a certain way, that's part of the practice that's transferred over generations. So it's something that, of course, is certainly it's something that's within, and that kind of knowledge can travel. So what happens when you have somebody who's trained in a kind of calligraphy that originates in India, and then they move to East Africa, and then that whole tradition and is translocated in a way and changes. So it's a very interesting question. So thank you for that.
I also want to add something that something I read in books. I don't know if it's factually correct. So Vivek, please correct me if I'm making if I'm telling lies. So I was reading about, like, in the past, the craftsmen who make the Hindu temples were also making the Buddhist temples. So the craftsmen didn't really care much about the beliefs. They were just doing their jobs. And because of that, like, these skill sets or aesthetics and motifs were kind of shared between different religious practices, because they literally share the same group of people making the stuff. So
that's absolutely correct. Yeah, okay, that's great. Absolutely correct. The people who in the ancient and medieval periods, you have, because you're dealing a lot with lithic architecture that could be moved around and repositioned in various ways. It didn't matter what, to a certain extent, what religion, or actually in when you're talking about architecture, it's really social class the person was, but what is really but what was important was their training, the kinds of stone they could cut, whether they were from what region of India they were from, whether that was the experience, what they had in their bodies, their abilities, was what was really important. So, and there was a lot of moving between Buddhist and Hindu, and also after the 12th century, especially between Hindu and Muslim. So that's very important to think about in transcultural craft, if that's the framing.
And just responding to Roisin's, you were talking about, like, craft is something that people return to in difficult times. And I was thinking, like, there's definitely a reason for that, the kind of return to human nature in a way, with this basic manual labor of making and touching materials and reshaping them into certain things. And that's just a very primal urge and instinct as human beings. And I think returning to craft and returning to this bodily engagement with the material is really a healing process.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like during the pandemic, a lot of people on an amateur level just picked up some kind of craft skills, maybe because they didn't have the time normally, but I feel like it did have a healing kind of aspect to it for a lot of people, even if they didn't recognize it as such. I think it was something that as a world, we probably engaged in more because of the kind of social trauma and dislocation than we would normally have done. Mm-hmm.
We have a
also,
very good question from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah. It says, thank you for an interesting discussion. I was struck by the connections between the talks and the speakers, particularly on global exchange. Do the speakers think this is as effectively applied today, given how ideas can be exchanged across the world in seconds, but might have different impacts or effects compared to the past?
What does that mean? Does it mean like the Zoom thing revolutionized the global exchange? I think, yeah, it did. But I also think that we don't understand the past as much, like how people were actually communicating with each other. And it's not really a matter of time and means, but also I think it's a matter of mentality. How do you perceive and conceive your relationship with other people? And I was reading about the Silk Road, and I was really struck and moved by the sentence in the introduction. So it says something about how there was no notion of the border. There was only, the mountains and the oceans that separated people. And I think that was just really, really profound, how people in the past didn't think of establishing really strict borders and preventing mobility. And I guess that's why there's a lot of nomadic tribes in the past, because they were able to travel between places. Yeah, so I think, like, if we look at the Silk Road and many historical movements, I think the world has always been actively, engaged in the process of communication in culture, and also, facilitated by trade, and also the like promotion of religious ideas, stuff like that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I would say add something is that there's a lot of presentism in the notion of global exchange or even globalism as an idea when it comes to things like art making or art practices, because there's not a sense of past history, like we can speak of the medieval period or early modern period, but even more recent history. You have people, architects like I.M. Hay, or a jewelry designer like Cartier, who is in dialogue with and drawing upon Islamic architecture and Islamic design. But it seems like that history or that sense of engagement with these processes is somehow constantly being revisited or constantly being presented as new. So I think that, in a way, it's when a Chinese artist like Mengyun is working with Islamic practices or even Indian practices, these things should be historicized or thought of it in a longer arc of makers that have been doing this for a long time. So that's I think that's how I would answer this question.
I don't know.
And to add, I guess, the internet and the kind of the immediacy of cultural transmission can, I suppose, lend itself to a sense of universality of craft, of design, and whether and I don't know the answer to this, is there such a thing, as universal craft ideas, universal design, or is this something that, a dominant culture assumes is universal, and, as a English-speaking person, if I, see something from another culture that, comes to me, I assume that I understand it perhaps more easily because it's so immediate, because it feels so real, it feels so immediate. But actually, it's very important to maintain an awareness of the cultural specificity and the way that things are interpreted, the way that things are made, the way that things in different cultures have different contexts and different meanings. And so I think that while the kind of immediacy of global exchange can create a sense of universality, and maybe that is accurate, and I'm sure in a lot of senses it is really helpful, there are also one also has to be cautious, I guess, about that, and without, thinking about the processes by which things get to different cultures and how and why, and the different contexts that the culture gives to them.
Yeah, and in an Indian context, craft is extremely vernacular. It's part of an everyday. So if you look at textile technologies across the subcontinent, each textile is suited to different climates and different places, and heavily rooted within a locale, within a very maybe even specific to a particular corner of a region. So there's a way in which, yes, there is global exchange that's happening across periods, whether or not a Muslim cloth made in Bengal is suited to the cold climate of Kashmir is something that one should think about, and whether or not how those crafts move over, how crafts are adapted really to various regions, I think is very important to think about.
Yeah, I think in a way, the audience, they also sense, all those connections we're trying to draw, coming from one single activating point today, which is Mengyun's residency and the wonderful work she has shared with us. And then having the contribution from both Roisin and Vivek, together, you have really created this very rich context. And in a way, I feel the very last question makes us think about, with the new technology and communication we can have, everything can happen instantly. But what are the sacrifices, or what are the things we're missing at the same time while we're enjoying this convenience? So I feel like there have been so many aspects that we can reflect upon. And thank you all so much for your wonderful and really creative and insightful contributions. Last but not least, if you have enjoyed this online talk today, next Friday, the 30th of September, Center for Chinese Contemporary Art in Manchester, we are offering a one-day opportunity to visit Mengyun during the Open Studio event. The information can be found on our website. It's a completely free event. You would only need to register or drop in if you're passing by our building. Let us thank again Mengyun, Vivek, and Roisin for your contribution today. And I'm sure we have all enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.